great pleasure for me to introduce to you all John Devoy. John is living down in beautiful Rosscarbery in West Cork. And he's written this wonderful book called Quandam, which some of you have heard me talk about, and some of my book club and other friends have read it as well. The format tonight is we will have a chat with John. He'll read a bit from the book. We'll take a pause. There's a little competition for a trivial quiz for anybody who gets the answer. Whoever gets the answer right first will get a copy of John's signed book. But the background to this basically is 1985, 1st of April, John left working in Cork University as a lab technician there and headed off on his bike for 2 years. He first went up to the Northern Cape and then cycled all the way down to Cape Town. His book starts in Cairo and takes it from there. But just to set it in context for myself, John, I read your book in the first lockdown. I just discovered it purely by accident. It was a great read for me because it took me out of Ireland and away down the Nile, and you followed your journey all the way down the Nile, all the way to Khartoum, and then you went on this mad trip by rail, sleeping under patrol car, Toyota patrols, out to Darfur on a train, the bike with you. And then you came back by truck. Then you jumped on an airplane. Instead of going to Ethiopia, which may have considered to be the easier way, you jumped on an airplane, went into South Sudan, which was in civil war at the time, crossed into Zaire at the time, and then went through Virunga Park, and then all the way to Nairobi. Now, we'll discover as we go on tonight really what all the different things that happened to you. I will try and draw out a few of them. But it was also a pleasure for me to have to read the book again in preparation, also through this lockdown. So maybe, John, I go over to you, and maybe you just introduce the book and maybe get people who haven't read the book, maybe just give them a flavor of the book.
Thank you, John, and welcome to Rosscarbery in West Cork. It's not raining, so the weather is quite mild outside. Firstly, it's an honor really to be participating in this and to be invited by John to the Orwell Wheelers. I should add, Orwell Wheelers is not the first cycling club to have me. There's a local one here in Rosscarbery, Clonakilty, but I've spoken to John about that, and maybe on a long bicycle ride he might inform you what happened that night. Didn't go too well, but that was a couple of years ago and people weren't prepared. I hope we're better prepared tonight. We wouldn't be here but for the book Quandam. I wrote it. In fact, I'll tell you something interesting that I only discovered tonight in my own preparation. You'll read, or whoever has read, that I went through 33 countries and 33,000 kilometers of cycling. Not until this afternoon did I discover that it's 33 years since I departed in 85 to when the book was published. I was just adding up the numbers. So if you want a quick synopsis of the whole thing, just think 33, 33, 33, and you'll have the bones of it. Before I read anything from the book, I should say it's unusual. It's an unusual book in many respects. Obviously, the first one is that it took a long time to write it. It's not that I'm a slow writer. I can say, and I'm sure everybody will understand, had I written this book a year or 2 years or even 5 years after returning from that trip, we wouldn't be sitting here tonight. It would be a very different book. It would be typical of many of the travel books that are just thrown out there too fast, too soon, without the traveler, without the experience or really understanding what they've done. So had I written it when I was 30 years of age rather than when I was 55, when I began, it would be a very different, superficial sort of book. And sadly, a lot of people say there is a problem with travel books, because I feel they're like wine that could be matured to a good bottle, but it's just pushed and pushed out to the audience too fast. So I'm very glad it took me time to digest that journey. And it's unusual also because, as John mentioned, it's not chronological. It begins in Cairo. I began the journey in Cork. So it begins, and when you read the first few pages, very quickly you discover that guy has been on the road for 9 months. So he's been cycling already 9 months. And I deliberately chose Cairo for lots of reasons. And it's probably, I'll wait until we're sitting together face to face to get into that. But there are reasons why I began in Cairo. It's not what you might think. And I ran into that problem with the first cycling club, the local one, when people thought it was a pure, unadulterated cycling book about wheels and saddles and transmission systems and miles or kilometers. But I think anybody who has read it will see that it's something else. And that was what I was trying to get across. I didn't want to do a tell you book. I mentioned Dervla Murphy because she wrote the introduction. When I spoke to Dervla, she read it and she said a few things to me. She said, you're going to have fun with this book because it will be very difficult to pigeonhole it. It's not pure travel. It's not a normal bicycle book. It's got a bit of everything. And that's how travel is. If you travel by bicycle, and as we know, you're going to experience things. And if you travel imagine traveling on your own for 2 months, and then maybe 6 months, 9 months, a year. So I began the book in Cairo. I was already well bedded into the process of journeying. So once you get over 9 months cycling, things begin to change. You begin to experience your cycling journey in a very different way. And that's what I try to get across in this book. The actuality, the in-your-faceness of travel. And actually, it has very little to do with the 2 wheels and the saddle you're sitting on. It has to do with people. It has to do with what you see. I always say travel is a 2-way street. And sadly, a lot of the travel books, they give you one side of the street. They tell you what the traveler is seeing or what they're doing. And that was what Dervla Murphy told me very emphatically. She said, don't tell your story. It took me a while to understand what she meant. She said, you must try and show it. Now that's anybody who's tried to write anything, that's a standard throwaway, don't tell, show. It's the hardest thing to do. And that's why it took 5 years to write Quandam. I had to learn how to show you the journey. If I had simply wanted to tell you the story, I probably would have rehashed the diaries, which are here on the table. I can show you. I would have just thrown it out and you'd get a diary recounting, a telling. So I had to write it in a certain way that tried to make it your journey. It's really not so much about me. When you read it, it's your journey. It's a bit like Fergal saying, I'm handing over the reins to John Collins and now you're in charge. I tried to write Quandam, so I'm handing over the reins slowly, chapter by chapter to you, and you feel the journey. And that's what took the effort and the time. And I won't make any apologies about that. Now, let's get on to a reading. And my editor, Maurice Sweeney, who's into his 70s, asked me to encapsulate the entire book into 4 lines. He said, give me 4 lines so I can stick on the front of the book. And very few people have got onto me or messaged me about these 4 lines. But I spent, I think, a couple of weeks trying to encapsulate the entire book into 4 lines, and I will read those 4 lines before we begin. Is everybody with me? I hope.
Yep.
So Quandam is a tale of search and adventure, intimacy and renewal, landscapes and imagination, long before the tech umbilical. So I mean by that, as we know, it was a long time before apps and sat nav and iPhones and what were the technology we're using now. As some of us will well remember, it was that time. Now, I should add, they are the 4 most important lines for me in the book, but my wife has a very different take. She says that the 3 most important lines in the book are dedicated to my wife, Sarah, and our 3 children, Oshin, Aisha, and Marion. So for Sarah, everybody has a different take on things. So there are her important lines. And now I'm going to read the very first paragraph to get us into the mood further. And Quandam is full of paradoxes. It's written to keep throwing you. It's not travel is not a straight line. It twists and turns inside in yourself as well as on the road. So even the title of the opening chapter, chapter 1, it sort of throws you, and that's done deliberately. Chapter 1, the Nile is Egypt, Egypt is the Nile. On the top floor of the Oxford Hotel, the window I wanted to open just wouldn't. Layers of old paint had sealed it. But then, with one final sharp pull, the chill air suddenly rushed in, and I stuck my head out into the last day of the year. Dusk was sweeping fast over Cairo. Down below on Talat Harb Street, the busyness of the day was almost done, and bar some traffic and the occasional honk of a taxi, the street was emptying itself. The city's foot soldiers, Egypt's urban fellaheen, were drifting home. Across the street, in another window, 1 floor lower, a small plastic Christmas tree blinked its white lights in an otherwise darkened building. Off on, off on, off on. A lone token to Christian tradition, but enough to make me think of home, until the umpteen minarets called out to prayer and a Quranic rhythm wafted over us all. So that is the opening paragraph, and I'm going to pause now if John or anybody else has something, but there's not a lot of, you don't think you're getting into a bicycling story with that. And also it might, as I said earlier, I'm parachuting you straight into the heat of battle, straight into Cairo. And the following day, I'm about to leave Cairo for Egypt. So that's how it begins. And I'm going to pause myself now in case.
Well, I was going to get you
There's a
to
question.
just quickly, John, maybe to go on a little bit further in the book and look at maybe the bit where you're cycling on railway tracks, just to give the guys a flavor of you. You're in the Sudan and you're the only route you've selected. I think it's page 177, is it?
Yes.
And just to give the guys a flavor of the endurance that you put yourself through.
Page, yeah. So just to give it, I'm not sure if, or how many people have read it, but there were no roads in Sudan back then. Since writing the book, and I'm going on a tangent here, but just to give it a bit of context, lots of people have sent me lots of books and messages from guys who have cycled down through Africa. And there is a nice, smooth, flat, tarred road going right from Egypt all the way down to Khartoum. In fact, all the way you just zoom along. So please bear in mind that I spent most of my time not in a tarred road, but pushing the bike through sand. It was a different world. And when I left a town in, if you're familiar with the bend of the Nile, where the Nile makes a great bend, I'm sort of south of that bend and heading towards Khartoum. And I, for some reason, think that there's a tarred road outside the city of Shendi, but there wasn't a tarred road, not for another 300 kilometers. And then I'm going to read a section here where I see telegraph poles in the distance going in a straight line. And I realize they're following the railway track. And I think to myself, if I can get my bike, which was a Mercian bike, onto the railway track, then that should be easy. So with your permission, I will read that. Except for a perfectly straight line of conspicuous telephone poles, I would never have noticed the train track. The track, of course, the track. Suddenly, the way to Khartoum became clear, dead straight clear. And from the bones of that day, I made my way between the rails. Once you avoid being hit by a train, cycling on a railway line is not so bad. The sleepers were buried under a ballast of grit and stone, and layers of wind-blown sand covered intermittent sections, in places almost to the rail itself. Riding would have been a dawdle, but for the corrugations, those dastardly little rolling mounds shuddering bike and body to bits. Corrugations, every trailblazing dirt road driver's agony, but for a cyclist, it's a whole other bumpy story. Why were they up here between the rail lines, I wondered. I had only ever experienced them on dirt trails where the wheels of vehicles were frequent. But here, did passing trains or wind eddies stir up these bumps into their corrugated shape? As I shuddered over them, I cursed them, then got to know them, then forgave them, recalling Amsterdam's cobbled streets and those ancient pavements in Krakow. How easy it was there when spokes went twang with bike shops everywhere. But here, Jesus. I stopped to drink, to wipe sweat, to give my arms a rest, to look around into a yellow glare of space. And I was transported back to my old flat in Cork with Brian laughing loudly and Paul advising somberly, "You'll need heavier gauge spokes." Gee, guys, if you could see where the wheels are now. And then, in that very moment, I sorely wished they could have been transported like Scotty transporting Kirk and Spock to materialize before my eyes, and we would all ride a little way, and we'd see the glare together. And then they'd know, yes, they'd know what this ride was really like. But they left me, and the glare returned, and the spokes held. But you never knew until you felt the wobble or heard the twang. So that's what it was like on a railway track in Sudan.
Very good, John. Thanks for that. That was really nice. John, look, we're a cycling club, so we might as well talk a little bit about the bike, and you might as well just tell the guys, did you get anything done to the bike before you headed off? You had a lot of panniers, you had about 30K worth of stuff in it, 30 kilograms of gear with you. You had a lot of issues along the road with the bike. It was bent and twisted, and you seemed to find people along the way who repaired it for you.
Yeah, name the issue. I think I went through the lot. Yeah, you don't cycle any bike. Well, today I don't know. I'm not up to speed with modern touring bikes, but certainly then it was a Mercian frame, Mercian 531 tubing, Shimano gears. It had extra spokes, as I mentioned earlier, in the rear wheel. I'm not sure if people remember Harding's bike shop in Cork City. Harding's it's gone now, sadly, but Harding's was a well-known bike shop, the bike shop in Cork City for generations. And it was Daw Harding helped me to put the bike together. You see a picture of it there. I hope you can see it. The saddle, I still cycle on the saddle, a good old Brooks B17. The handlebars were just dropped handlebars. The gears were very simple. They were down on the down tube. I used Jim Blackburn front and rear carriers. Jim Blackburn, brilliant. I still have them. They will see me out. You know, they're brilliant pair of. I'm not even sure, somebody might say if Jim Blackburn is still going these. I don't know, but brilliant pair of. And I used, if you look at the picture, pannier bags. The front ones are covered with sort of a brown plastic to keep the dust and the rain off, but they're red and they're made by, I was telling John the other day, by a company in Waterford, Sport House. And Liam Power, who founded Sport House, just the year before I left in 1984, he was made redundant and started a company in Waterford called Sport House, and they made bags. I got onto Liam. They didn't make pannier bags. I think mine were probably the first pair he made. Made lots of other gear from Cordura. So the pannier bags were, you can see them there, tough Cordura, 2 rear, 2 front, and a handlebar bag, and pretty simple. You know, it was a simple. You could see a couple of racks for bottles. Most of my water was carried inside the panniers to keep it cool. And problems, yeah. Every single kind of problem. By the time I got to Nairobi, I needed a complete new rear wheel, a new transmission, I went through 3 blocks, 4 chains. Don't ask about punctures, hundreds and hundreds, I would say. In one day alone, I'll remember it forever, I had 5 punctures near just leaving the border of Namibia to South Africa, because there were a certain type of thorn that had 3 sides, and I had 5 punctures within a couple of hours. So yeah.
And you kept your spare money, your reserve money in the down bar, is that right?
In the down tube. I'd have to unscrew the saddle, take the saddle off, which was bolted on, and I had a little plastic bag with maybe $400 in small notes, $1, $5. You don't bring big notes to some countries. So that was all wrapped up. And I just want to show, if I may, John, I have, so those of you who have read the book will, or might, remember a belt that I referred to.
Yeah.
It was given to me by an English guy in Khartoum before he left. And that is a belt, which, this is the inside. So this is the part around the waist, and it has a zip. So in there, on the inside of that belt, I would roll up dollars like cigarettes, and they were stashed in there. So when you see, it's not a thick belt, it's only an inch in width. I had $600 around my waist, plus money here hanging around my neck. So it was a cash. There were no Visa cards. It was pure cash all the way.
John, I'm going to move on just to another thing. Like, one of the things I just wanted to ask you about was, you know, you did this solo, and that was you made a conscious decision to do this journey solo. And in the book, you write about meeting. Well, first of all, there's a few things that come out of the book. One is you waited till you were 28. You felt, and you meet a young German guy called Tom, who's 22, and you're crossing from Egypt, I think, into Sudan. And you know you're going to have this conversation with him to say, listen, you can't come with me. I'm out to do this on my own. And can you just give us some background. Why was it important to do this journey all on your own? I mean, a lot of people like to to cycle for the social aspect, but to do this thing and for some of the things that happened to you, which we'll touch on later. But
we spoke about this. Solo was the only way to go. If you want to, remember, we're not talking going on a 3-month trip. We're going for 2 years. So 2 years, even though it's short when you look back when you're in your 50s and 60s, but 2 years is quite a chunk of time to sit on a saddle. But I wanted more from the journey. I wasn't, and I suppose this is the problem I had with my local cycling club. They were cyclists. They loved getting on the bike, particularly at weekends, and going 50, 60, 70, 100K, and really with, as you say, John, with a bunch of guys and having fun, having a coffee or a beer afterwards. This is different. So you got to switch. I'm using a bike, but I'm making a journey. So I'm not going, when I was setting out on April Fool's Day, I didn't tell myself I was going on a bike trip. I was using a Mercian bike to make a journey. So there's a big difference. So making a journey, that now the bike becomes secondary. You're just using it. You're making a journey. And I knew I was 28, from the little trips I had done, that you always got more, as I said to John a night ago when we spoke about this, more bang for your buck when you're solo. And anybody would tell you that if you're with your mate and you're going to travel anywhere for a couple of months, sure, you'll enjoy it. You'll enjoy your mate, he or she will enjoy you, but you will also know you're going to, that relationship, that camaraderie, that cultural cord that you have with your own buddy, that militates against you exposing yourself to the rawness of, especially when you go into different cultures.
John Devoy has always had a sense of adventure, a need to explore new horizons. Today, at the age of 62, he lives on a 6-acre organic farm near Roscarbery in West Cork, along with his wife Sarah and 3 teenage children.
You could go mad and make a chutney or something.
Yeah, you could, yeah.
Whether to leave them or take them down.
Take out that side shoots.
But as a young boy, John had dreams of travelling much further afield. Born in 1957, John grew up in Whitegate, East Cork, close to the oil refinery where his father Thomas worked as a mechanic. When John was 9 years old, the international demand for engineers in a booming oil industry led to his father accepting a job in Libya.
A Pandora's box of history, yeah.
My father worked in Libya. He was there about 2 years. And I was a young 9-year-old. Lots of postcards came. All of that stuff that came back from Libya, not just fed into our wanderlust, gave me the confidence to do whatever I wanted to do.
In 1985, John decided to quit his job as medical laboratory technician in Cork University Hospital to embark on his own journey of discovery. Looking for advice, he paid a visit to the pioneering travel writer Dervla Murphy, author of Full Tilt, an account of her trip by bicycle from Ireland to India in the 1960s.
We had a long conversation about travel, about adventure. I remember leaving, it was late and I was cycling back to Cork, and on the doorstep, as I left, she says, well, it's going to be a great adventure. You go out there and come back with a story to share.
So that's exactly what John did. Over the course of 24 months, he travelled from North Cape in Norway to Cape Town, South Africa. just himself and a bicycle.
I've heard people describe, and it's common to say, we're going off-grid. I describe my adventure as pre-grid. There was no phones, there was no satellite navigation, there was no GPS, there was nothing.
It's now over 30 years since John completed his epic journey. But he's only recently published the first book of a planned trilogy telling the story. So why the wait?
I had to wait for years and to create some distance between the person who actually did the journey. I say, that was me, that was once upon a time. Now I understand what he did, and I can tell you the story.
It really needs to take its time. And working on a busy farm, day after day, 850 chickens, a few children being nurtured and grown along the way, it was a very, very busy space. Writing a book on top of all that, it was very, very challenging.
John finally got the push he needed when he was asked to prepare a talk about his travels to the Rosscarbery Historical Society.
Being approached by the Rosscarbery Historical Society really gave me it lit the fuse to writing the book. And now the more I read the letters, the more I read the diaries, the more I realised I'm ready now.
Yeah, the back from Giora Biran, Haifa, Israel.
The talk was in 2012. It was 2016 when I found him starting the book. I called to his house one day to buy some groceries from the farm, and I found him hunched over the computer.
John's first book recounts a section of his journey between Cairo and Nairobi. It's called Quandam, Travels in a Once World.
Quandam means a period of time that has passed. To do that journey would be impossible today. And I recall describing in the book the journey across the Bayuda Desert, 300 kilometres, not very far from here to Dublin. But back then there was no road. It took me nearly 12 and a half days. You're literally dragging the bike through sand. So the physical journey is completely different. And these are the shorts I wore. These were bought in Amsterdam, in Holland, and they were proper cycling shorts. But by the time I got to Egypt, they began to fray. I had no choice but put patches in. And in Bunia, which is in the Ituri rainforest in the Congo, it was either get rid of it or do a big job. And the tailor in Bunia did this magnificent patch. So they each have memories.
Alone, John faced many challenges, including a hit and run in Egypt that damaged his bike and a bout of cerebral malaria in the Congo. But the hardest part of his journey came on his arrival in Nairobi, when John received a telegram from home. His father had died and been buried, and John hadn't known.
To hear about that at a point, in a potentially high point of John's journey, I can only imagine how crushing that would have been.
So I seriously asked myself, should I return home? The embassy staff gave me all the time to communicate with my family. And I remember my youngest brother saying, and come home for what? To stand by your dad's grave? And he said, and then what?
He acknowledges it himself that these are the things that are part of the risks of taking these trips. And there is nothing you can do about it. You have to accept that. And I think that's the way he took it too.
The support from family and friends was take the news, but continue.
After finally completing his travels, it was the return to Cork and his life as a medical laboratory technician that John was perhaps least prepared for.
Coming back is the hardest because you've exposed yourself to so much experience, to so much life. It is like taking 10 years of life, normal life, and squeezing it down into 2.
It's very hard to slot back into a 9 to 5.
To say it's a culture shock is an understatement, and to fit back in with work colleagues who perhaps had a whole different perspective on their life, whole different set of values, that's extremely challenging.
In 1990, John met Sarah while she was studying for a master's degree. 4 years later, they got married and started a family. But he became increasingly restless in his old job. His travels had given him a different mindset. John had a desire to work outdoors, to engage with nature, and to do something that contributed to a community. So, in 1999, he resigned from his job, sold his house, and decided to take on the new challenge of starting an organic farm. John and Sarah put everything they had into their new adventure. A massive risk for a couple with a young family.
It was a huge challenge because my wife has no farming background, so we were going into this organic farming decision. If I use the word green, we were really green.
It was absolutely extraordinary, the challenges we faced. This was a greenfield site. We had to put in our water, our electricity. We often compared ourselves with the Flintstones. We were down there digging holes, trying to plant 500 apple trees, thinking we were doing amazing, and then they didn't work.
It was a big challenge to set up that farm. John really had to start and learn everything from scratch, but that's in the nature of the chap. He is a very adventurous person, and he applies himself with terrific force to these things.
Despite many setbacks, John and Sarah were determined to pursue an environmentally friendly approach to farming and the planet. Eventually, their perseverance paid off. The farm began to thrive, and their organic produce became a fixture in local markets, shops, and restaurants.
The reason it is here, I believe, was because I more or less took the energy of the journey and I used that energy, that relentless determination, to create it. I said, right, if I can travel and cycle to South Africa, I can start a farm.
With his children now almost grown up, John has decided to lease the farm in order to devote more time to his writing.
Life moves on. I'm 62. I've written one book. The biggest job at hand at the moment is the writing of the sequel.
I feel the process of writing for John is an absolute extraordinary journey. It's such an affirming, incredible thing to do.
And after taking so long for John's first book, when can we expect his second?
My apologies to all of those who had to wait 30 years for the first book, but I promise it will not be 30 years. It will be far, far less than that.